A quick recap. So we have ingested our food. That food was a mixture of carbohydrates, proteins, lipids, vitamins, and minerals. We performed mechanical digestion on it in our mouth using muscles of mastication and teeth. We secreted in saliva using our parasympathetic nervous system, the facial nerve and glossopharyngeal nerves stimulating saliva production. Inside that saliva, we mixed in a buffer, and we mixed in the first enzyme to know, salivary amylase. That amylase started to digest the carbohydrates into smaller carbohydrates. So then the mouth forms a mass of food mixed with saliva known as the bolus. And we swallowed that bolus. It went from the oral cavity into the oropharynx, then laryngopharynx, then esophagus. We use the epiglottis to prevent it from going into the respiratory tract. Then the esophagus used its 2 layers of smooth muscle to perform peristalsis, which moves the bolus down the esophagus towards your stomach. The lower esophageal sphincter relaxed to allow the bolus to enter the stomach, and then the lower esophageal contracted to prevent the stomach acid from going up into the esophagus. So here we are. We're in the stomach. The anatomy of the stomach is very important. It has 4 major regions. The cardia is where the bolus is going to enter. The fundus is this upper rounded portion of the stomach. This whole area here is known as the body. And then basically the end of the stomach before the material enters the duodenum of the small intestine is called the pylorus. So 4 regions of the stomach. It has an additional muscle layer called the oblique layer. So notice we've got a longitudinal, circular, and now an oblique layer. And that additional smooth muscle layer is going to allow the stomach to do more of a churning activity. So it really can mix that bolus in with the secretions that are produced by your stomach. You can see the inside of the stomach has these pretty big folds to it called rugae. That's going to allow the stomach to expand or basically unfold when it fills. So the stomach doesn't have the ability to stretch that much. It does stretch a little bit, and it can detect when it stretches, but it unfolds. And then when it empties, it kind of collapses in, and you can see these rugae much more prominently when the stomach is empty. It's got a couple curvatures, kind of has what's called the lesser curvature here, the greater curvature here. And then there's another sphincter called the pyloric sphincter. That's the one that's going to regulate the material leaving the stomach. But we don't want the material just to go right through the stomach quickly. We want the stomach to hold it up a bit. So it kind of acts as a reservoir for the food, for the material. It slows things down a little bit, and then we can slowly release the contents into the small intestine. All right, and then the small intestine can take its time doing its digestion. Okay, so let's look at the major functions. Mixes the saliva, food, and gastric juice to form chyme. So the food enters, right? It's got saliva mixed in there. We're going to secrete what's called gastric juice. All right. That gastric juice is going to contain, we're going to look down here, it's going to contain stomach acid, hydrochloric acid. It's going to contain a couple enzymes. It's going to contain a molecule called intrinsic factor. So it's going to mix all that stuff in. It really liquefies the bolus into almost like a paste called chyme. Chyme is going to be highly acidic, and it's going to then move on into the duodenum of the small intestine. So it serves as a reservoir. Again, it kind of slowly releases the material into the small intestine. The hydrochloric acid is going to serve a number of purposes. One is it's going to kill most of the things that are in the foods you eat. So bacteria, all right, we're always consuming bacteria in the food we eat because food is not sterile. So we need to make sure we kill any potential pathogens with that hydrochloric acid. It also denatures the protein. So that's really the important thing as far as digestion is concerned. Denaturing a protein is basically unfolding it. If you recall, proteins, whether they're your proteins made by your cells or whether they're the proteins in your hamburger, those proteins at one point functioned. All right, and in order for a protein to function, they have to fold and have this folding structure. Well, it's very difficult to digest a protein when it's all folded up. So the stomach plays a very important role in that it's going to unfold that protein so the enzymes can get in there and digest it. And that's the job of the acid. Heat also denatures. So when you cook your food, that does a little bit of denaturing of the proteins, makes them a little easier to digest. But once it hits that stomach acid, we can really denature those proteins. Then we're going to add in an enzyme. And the enzyme begins as what's called pepsinogen. That's basically an inactive enzyme, but then it gets converted into the active enzyme called pepsin. So pepsin is going to begin the digestion of proteins. All right, so we haven't been digesting proteins yet. We've only been digesting carbohydrates. And speaking of carbohydrates, the salivary amylase that was functioning in your mouth kind of functioned all the way down the esophagus, right? As the bolus was traveling down the esophagus, is no longer going to work in the stomach. Whenever there's a dramatic change in pH, enzymes that work at one pH probably don't work at a vastly different pH. So if you remember, that salivary amylase kind of functions best at neutral pH, around 7. But when it hits the stomach, where the pH is like 1 or 2, that enzyme no longer works. So we no longer digest carbohydrates in the stomach. All right, we're going to kind of stop the carbohydrate digestion temporarily and begin the protein digestion. The stomach also secretes an intrinsic factor. You might recall that molecule. It's going to help absorb B12. If the stomach is not producing enough of this intrinsic factor and you don't absorb B12, that can lead to pernicious anemia. And then there is a lipase called gastric lipase. So now we got 2 lipases. We had the lingual lipase from salivary glands. That one's going to start working. And then the gastric lipase. So in the stomach, we're going to digest protein and lipids, all right, triglycerides. But we're no longer digesting carbohydrates. And then the stomach also produces a hormone. There's going to be basically 3 hormones to know in this chapter. One of them is called gastrin, so it kind of suggests who makes it. That's the stomach. But remember, it's a hormone. It doesn't go into the lumen of the stomach. It's going to go into the bloodstream. And it's kind of the hormone that tells everyone else that food just entered, right? It's one way we can kind of notify other organs that food just entered the stomach. So if you're part of this digestive system, you kind of need to wake up because material is coming down. So what cells do all this? We obviously have smooth muscle that does the churning. We've got a couple different mucus-producing cells. Your stomach is known for having a very thick layer of mucus compared to other parts of the GI tract, and that's the reason why it can tolerate the hydrochloric acid. All right, it has a thicker mucus layer. The esophagus doesn't have thick mucus, so it could be damaged by the hydrochloric acid, so we got to keep it out of there. The small intestine, the duodenum, doesn't have thick mucus, so we're going to have to do something about that acid that's going to be entering the duodenum. Parietal cells are the cells that produce the hydrochloric acid and the intrinsic factor. Chief cells are the cells that produce the enzymes, pepsinogen, which becomes pepsin and gastric lipase. And then there's an endocrine cell of the stomach that produces the hormone gastrin. And your stomach's kind of known for having what's called gastric pits. Those are these kind of invaginations of the epithelium, kind of forms these little pits. And a lot of those cells are found deep in those pits of the mucosa. So notice you've got a mucosa, a submucosa, the muscularis, now with 3 layers, and the serosa on the outside. This slide talks exactly how stomach acid is produced. Stomach acid is an important concept to understand because we have a number of people struggling with heartburn or gastroesophageal reflux disease, or GERD. So what we're looking at here, over here would be the lumen of the stomach. So this is where the acid needs to go. So notice there's the hydrogen and the chloride. So together that's hydrochloric acid. Here's the bloodstream, but what I want you to focus on is this parietal cell here. This parietal cell is producing the acid, and it does it by using basically 2 little channels. It has what we call a proton pump. That's going to be pumping the protons or the hydrogen ions into the lumen, and then it has a chloride channel. So together, the protons, the hydrogen ions, and the chloride ions form the hydrochloric acid. All right, and there's a few stimuli for this. One is your vagus nerve. So your vagus nerve is going to stimulate stomach acid production. There's also a molecule called histamine, which we've heard of, but this histamine isn't related to inflammation. It actually stimulates stomach acid production. And then gastrin also will stimulate these cells. So you got 3, different stimuli that eventually lead to that stomach acid production. How do we treat GERD? Well, number 1 is we try to eat foods that don't stimulate as much stomach acid. There's certain things in foods that might increase stomach acid production. We definitely want to eat small meals, not very large meals. We definitely want to use gravity, so you don't really want to lay down after a large meal because the stomach acid can leak up the esophagus. There's a few things that weaken the lower esophageal sphincter. One of them is pregnancy. So pregnant women tend to get heartburn because there's a hormone that relaxes things. And one thing it relaxes is that sphincter. So you try to reduce certain foods in your diet. Alcohol, smoking can increase heartburn as well. But then there's some treatments. You could use an antacid. So those are basically buffers. They're calcium carbonate buffers that just kind of help to neutralize some of that acid. So Tums, Rolaids, there's a whole bunch of those. Then there's 2 medications that can help as well. You got proton pump inhibitors, or PPIs. You might have heard of Prilosec or omeprazole. So what that medication does is it actually blocks these little proton pumps. And it doesn't matter what the stimulus is, it'll block that stomach acid production. So those are pretty powerful acid reducers. You could also use what's called an H2 receptor blocker. The H2 stands for the histamine receptors that these cells have. If you can block the histamine stimulation, you can reduce stomach acid. So Tagamet, Zantac, Pepsid is another one. So there's a few different ways to go about reducing that stomach acid. Let's talk about how the stomach is controlled. So we call this phases of digestion, but we're kind of focusing in on that stomach. So the stomach, we've got a way to stimulate that stomach even before we eat. It's called the cephalic phase. And this you're very consciously aware of. If you start thinking of food, or you start to smell food, right? Or you start to maybe just start to taste that food, that activates the cephalic phase. So cephalic means your head, right? Something to do with your head. And in this case, it's your sensory organs in your head. So your sense of taste, your sense of smell, it involves your brain, right? Thinking about food. That'll activate this phase of digestion. And a couple things happen. Number one, we're going to stimulate the salivary glands, right? So your mouth will start to water. We also stimulate the vagus nerve. And the vagus nerve is going to go to the stomach and stimulate the stomach. So what do we mean by stimulating the stomach? We mean it's going to start producing all those secretions, right? It's going to produce pepsinogen. It's going to produce intrinsic factor. It's going to produce stomach acid. It's going to produce gastrin, and now gastrin goes into the bloodstream. And notice gastrin kind of is released by the stomach, but it even stimulates the stomach. So we're really going to get that stomach working even before the bolus enters the stomach. So now we've got a lot of acid and enzymes already in the stomach waiting for that bolus to enter. So that's called the cephalic phase. It basically prepares the mouth by stimulating saliva and prepares the stomach. It's going to activate neural centers in the brain, so cerebral cortex. So now you're going to be consciously aware of this. Hypothalamus and brainstem are involved. Again, the nerves are the vagus nerve stimulating the stomach, but also hormones, histamine and gastrin secretion. And then don't forget the two nerves that stimulate the salivary glands, the facial nerve and glossopharyngeal nerve. So these three nerves all contain parasympathetic neurons, right? Parasympathetic is your rest and digest activities. So since we're activating digestion, this is parasympathetic stimulation. Okay, so think about what happens next. So you walk into a restaurant, you're really hungry, you smell the food, you start to taste the food, you're thinking about how delicious this food is, you start to eat, you fill that stomach up. Now, when your stomach's full, think about whether that cephalic phase works anymore. It doesn't work for me. All right, if I start thinking about food on a full stomach, it doesn't seem to have the same effect. So the cephalic phase only works, right, before the stomach has food. Once the stomach has food, you need another phase to keep it active, all right, because the cephalic phase isn't going to be doing it anymore. So for this one, the stimulus, instead of thought, right, smell, taste, it's stretching of the stomach. So the stomach has stretch sensors in it. So it can detect distension, which is stretching. It also detects a pH change. To me, this is really interesting. So when your stomach is empty, basically all it has in there is stomach acid and mucus. So the pH is super low when your stomach is empty. But when you eat food, right, the food acts as a buffer. And it's mostly the proteins in your food. So when you add a bunch of protein to your stomach, the pH actually goes up. And that's another stimulus that the stomach uses to know that there's food inside of it. So it's stretching of the stomach and a rise in pH that tells the stomach, listen, you have to stay active. You have to keep secreting your hormones. You have to keep secreting your enzymes because you have food inside of you. All right? So that's basically what this phase, called the gastric phase, is all about. Promotes gastric secretion and motility, right? You still got to keep the muscle active as well. So we call that motility. Stretch sensors, chemoreceptors that detect the rise in pH, keep your parasympathetic neurons active and your enteric neurons. Enteric neurons are basically neurons of the intestines or the GI tract. Keep stimulating the gastric secretions and motility. Keep producing gastrin. All right, we want to keep producing that gastrin as long as the stomach has material in it. And then the stomach does its job. Now what happens? Well, the stomach is going to slowly begin to empty. All right, so if the stomach is slowly emptying, we have to have this third phase to basically inhibit the stomach, turn it off. All right, so how do we turn the stomach off? Well, we turn the vagus nerve off. All right, so the vagus nerve no longer stimulates the stomach. We use a couple hormones from the small intestine. All right, so remember, when chyme enters the small intestine knows. So now the small intestine is going to start to tell everyone, hey, now the material is inside of me, so you guys need to help me out and help me to do my thing, which is going to involve knowing the liver, gallbladder, and pancreas. But at the same time, these hormones known as secretin and cholecystokinin are going to inhibit the stomach. All right, so the intestinal phase, largely called intestinal because we're using two intestinal hormones, secretin and cholecystokinin, to inhibit the stomach. All right, so this phase is going to decrease gastric activities but promote the activity of the small intestine as well as the liver, gallbladder, and pancreas. So it uses stretch receptors and chemoreceptors of the small intestine to know that, okay, well, now the material is in the small intestine. We're going to inhibit the parasympathetic stimulation of the stomach, right? We're going to basically turn that vagus nerve off. All right. To keep the stomach off, we're going to use sympathetic stimulation. So we turn off the parasympathetic, turn on the sympathetic, and that shuts off your stomach. All right, because it's empty. We don't need it active. The small intestine produces cholecystokinin and secretin. We'll talk more about those coming up, but their effect on the stomach is inhibitory. They're going to inhibit stomach actions. All right. When we get to further topics, we're going to review these activities again. So cholecystokinin, or CCK, again, it inhibits the stomach, but it's going to activate the pancreas. All right, so it stimulates the pancreas to produce enzymes. Because remember, we need enzymes now in the small intestine. So a lot of those are going to come from your pancreas. It's going to eject bile from the gallbladder because we need bile to enter the small intestine. And then it also induces what we call satiety, which is your sense of feeling full. All right, so you kind of get this fullness feeling when the small intestine produces cholecystokinin. And then it inhibits gastric activities. Secretin is also going to stimulate the pancreas, but it's going to tell the pancreas we need a buffer, right? We need bicarbonate because the chyme that's entering the small intestine is very acidic. All right, so we need to buffer it right away. And that's another job of your pancreas. And then secretin also tells the liver you need to produce more bile. So notice what these two hormones are doing. They're going to inhibit the stomach, but they're going to stimulate the pancreas, the gallbladder, and the liver. All right? And those are the three organs that are required to help your small intestine do what it's going to be doing next. All right? This is a table, just a review of the hormones. I'm not going to go over this table, but you'll notice the three major hormones are gastrin, secretin, and cholecystokinin. I would probably emphasize the major effects for each of these. which I already did on the previous slides, but this is kind of a good review of those three major hormones. All right, so the next video we're going to start looking at what I call the big three: the pancreas, the liver, and the gallbladder. So they're all situated very close to the duodenum, all right, which is the first part of your small intestine. So they're all going to be helping out what your small intestine is going to be doing.